So there are two main lineages of Mahayana Buddhism that came down from the Buddha. One's called the lineage of widespread activities, and that came from Buddha Maitreya, from the Buddha to Maitreya, and then down to Asanga, and then down through lineage lamas. The other main lineage came from the Buddha to the Bodhisattva Manjushri, and then to Nagarjuna, down through Shantideva and other lineage lamas. So both the Samantabhadra prayer and Nagarjuna's 60 verses came through that profound view lineage down through the days until this current time. So we're going to go into the profound view. As I was saying, one wing of the Bodhisattva vehicle is skillful means. And that gets into the perfections, how to help beings, how to grow your bodhicitta, all that kind of stuff. The other wing is profound view, seeing things correctly so that your skillful means are joined with wisdom. So we're going to go into the wisdom side. But to begin with, there are just a few opening prayers you're welcome to join me with if you want. Sashi Buki Juche Do Tram Rirali Gambati Sange Jindo Neda Ubunanda Jinga Jajo Idan Guru Rana Mandala Kane Yami Sange Jodon Zogi Jona Jaju Badu Dani Kazuji Juji Gibes Dola Bench Sange Jodon Zogi Jaju Badu Dani Kazuji Juji Gibes Dola Bench Basho Sange Jodon Zogi Jona Jaju Badu Dani Kazuji Juji Gibes Dola Bench Sange Basho. So the text that we're going to go through is called the 60 verses. And those of you who like Tibetan, we'll go through it in English too. So don't be scared. We'll do the English as well. But the title, Rikpa, is reasoning or logic. Drukshupe means 60. Sikleo, verses, is in this text. And so that's what we're going to be going through. And in English, I decided to use, Gaia was very kind and sent me a Tibetan version of it. But I found this version, and if you want to follow on in a book, it's kind of tough reading. It was translated by Joseph Luizo, and it's called Nagarjuna's Reason 60 is how he translated the title. And it's got a commentary. The version that I heard was with Gyume Khensa Rinpoche, and Art was the translator. And Gyume Khensa Rinpoche used the exact same commentary that Joseph Luizo uses in his book. It's a commentary to the text by Chandrakirti, the great Madhyamaka master Chandrakirti. And there's another longer commentary by Kedubje. I'm not going to go through that. I don't have access to that translation anyway, but it's often referenced throughout the commentary. So if you want to do a little more reading and cut your teeth on Tibetan a little bit, this has both versions. It has it in English and Tibetan. Okay, so before we start, I'd like to give a little bit of background on the text, so you kind of can put it in perspective. Nagarjuna. Well, first, let me give you Gyume Khensa Rinpoche's introductory comments as he was launching into the text. He broke it down into three main points. One is why it's important to understand shunyata. And shunyata is a corner, that's the profound view lineage that I was mentioning before. Why is that important to understand? The second point is who are the masters from whence this lineage came? And the third point is what are the benefits of understanding it? Why is it important? Where did it come from? What are the benefits? So with the first point, what he said is without understanding emptiness, we cannot achieve liberation from samsara, nor can we achieve enlightenment. Anybody who knows Tsongkhapa's three principal aspects of the path knows by heart that without seeing the flaws of the cycle of birth and death and what keeps us trapped in the cycle of suffering that we're in, there's no way that we're going to get out of it. We're going to keep on cycling. It's like a prisoner who gets used to the guards and gets used to the cell. They're not going to break out. And so similarly, the very first step in Buddhism is to start to realize that we're in this cycle of existence. It's filled with suffering. All you have to do these days is watch the news, and you can see it everywhere. You know, the suffering around the world. It's scary and appalling. Then the second point, not only is it important to renounce so that you start to work to get yourself out of the cycle of existence, but the second point is if you only are in it for yourself, like this is a madhouse, the world is just crazy and full of suffering, I want out. But then it's considered shameful to leave everybody else behind, right? So I want to be free. I want happiness. I want the causes of happiness. And the rest of you, good luck. So that's considered a lower intention, just wanting to seek your own salvation. A higher intention, and that's what Mahayana means, great vehicle. It's the vehicle of bodhisattvas who have the attitude, just like I'm suffering and I want freedom from suffering, so are all sentient beings. All life is the same. All sentient beings at some point or another in this cycle of birth and death have been my mom. And they've cared for me with infinite kindness, just like my parents in this life. If I don't help them, whose job is it? If my mom was blind and insane and walking towards a precipice, and I, her child, was sitting there, how horrible would it be for me just to let her fall over the precipice? Now I have eyes. I can see with Dharma wisdom what's happening. My mom, blinded, not knowing what causes what, insane with the afflictions of mind. If I don't help her, whose job is it? So that's kind of the stance of the Bodhisattva. We're all equal. Nobody wants to suffer. Everybody wants to be happy in the same way. So I'm going to generate the wish to free all beings from suffering, just like I want to be free from suffering. In order to do that, in order to be able to accomplish that, I have to free myself, and I have to establish a state of mind in which I know how to lead others to that state beyond suffering. So that's the Bodhisattva attitude. However, that's the second principle. However, according to Tsongkhapa, even if you have those two states of mind, you can't get bodhicitta without renunciation, right? You need that to get to the bodhicitta. But even if you have that bodhicitta in mind, if you don't understand cause and effect and emptiness, you can't cut the root of that cycle, because the thing that keeps us in that cycle of suffering is ignorance. Two types of ignorance: the ignorance that clings to ourselves as if we're real and we exist from our own side and we don't depend on anything else. And then the other kind of ignorance is the ignorance that doesn't understand how karma, how cause and effect work. And so as long as we have those two types of ignorance, we're trapped. And so is everybody else. So this teaching is getting at that third point. How do we actually cut the root of samsara for ourselves and for others? Okay, so back to Yume Khyentse Rinpoche's commentary on this. In the 9th chapter of Shantideva's Bodhisattva Charya Avatara, he says that all of the teaching, anybody who's ever heard or read that text knows how incredible it is. But in the final, next to last chapter, he says, all of these teachings that I taught in other earlier chapters were taught by the Buddha in order to prepare you for understanding that things do not have an inherent nature. This is hard to comprehend. At first, I read this meme on the internet that said, imagine the arrogance of thinking that you're an independent self when really your body that you hold to be you is a configuration of countless cells all working together to form the illusion of an independent body, right? And so, anyway, that's just the beginning. But even that level of understanding kind of wakes you up a little bit. You know, I walk around as if I'm this body, but when you start breaking down the body into what it is, you realize it's kind of an illusion that you hold towards what your body is. So Atisha, the great Lama Atisha, said the entirety of Buddha's teachings are incorporated into 84,000 heaps of Dharma. A heap of Dharma, this is an old Indian idea, but if you have an elephant and you load the elephant down with ink until it can't carry anymore, and then you take that amount of ink and you start writing scriptures, after you finish using all the ink, all the scriptures that you wrote will be one heap of Dharma. and so the idea is that Buddha taught extensively, and it's almost immeasurable. It's meant to kind of blow your mind that there's so much to know. So all those 84,000 heaps of Dharma, which are directed to understand the ultimate nature of things. That's called the Dharmata. So everything that Buddha taught is meant to bring you to this subject. So the greatness of the teacher, there is a sutra called the Lanka Avatara Sutra. In that, Buddha prophesized Nagarjuna. He talked about that the question that came to the Buddha was, who will preserve your teachings in the future? And the Buddha taught that there would be a glorious one he called the Naga, who will destroy the extremes of being and non-being. And we're going to get into what that means. He will attain the joyous Bhumi and will be reborn in Sukhavati. Other sutras said that he would reach the 7th or 8th Bhumi. And then there are some teachings that are considered authoritative, like the commentary to the Guhya Samaja Tantra by Chandrakirti that said he attained the state of omniscience, that Nagarjuna attained the state of omniscience. So scholars attribute different amounts of time to his life. Most agree that he was born about 400 years after the Buddha. However, the length of his life is a subject of debate. My teacher, actually both of my teachers, Jume Kensler and Sarah Kenner, used to insist that he was able to live for 600 years. They say that early on he had a prophecy that he wouldn't live very long. And so he did all these things to try to extend his lifespan. And eventually he was able to figure out a way to live long enough to accomplish the path in a single life. And so anyway, that's the subject of much debate. Anyway, so Nagarjuna is known for composing 6 major texts, and this is one of them. The text that we're going to go over here is one of those texts. It's called the Sixfold Canon of Reasonings, his 6 major texts, the Riksok Druk in Tibetan. So one of them, this is like the main text, is the Madhyamaka, the fundamental wisdom. Mula Madhyamaka was like his major treatise. He also wrote finely woven treatise, Voidness 70. These are 70 verses on emptiness, and Rebuttal of Objections. And then the remaining 2 are this one, this Reason in 60 Verses, and Jewel Rosary. So those first ones, people will debate, well, why did he write this one if he wrote like the 70 verses? It's on the same subject. The answer is really a sub-commentary to the Mula Madhyamaka, whereas the 60 verses is really its own text. It's talking about its own subject, and it's a refutation. In his day, in Nagarjuna's day, the main 2 schools he was refuting were called the Vaibhashika and the Sautantrika schools of Buddhism. This text doesn't get so much to the extreme view of nihilism. It touches on it, but it's not its main focus. Nihilism, for those of you new to Buddhism, is the current view in most Western countries. It's the view that there is no cause. I mean, you don't have to worry about whether or not you get caught for bad deeds except by the law, right? And really nothing makes sense. You're going to die when you die. That'll be the end of your mind. And so just live it up. That's kind of the nihilist view. And we'll get into it. We'll talk about that view, and Nagarjuna does too. But it's considered by him in his day to be well refuted, that it was not true. It was an errant view that would lead people into misery. And if we look at the news, we can kind of see it doing that to us today. You know, like the more, when you watch movies about psychopaths, they're all nihilist. You know, if you look at their viewpoint, it's all that nihilistic point of view. So anyway, so that's one extreme. But in this text, the 60 verses of reasoning, Nagarjuna is hitting the other extreme. The other extreme, instead of nihilism, is called eternalism. And we can also see that these days, the eternalistic points of view, but we'll get into that a little bit later. There are four major sections to this text. The first teaches the Madhyamaka point of view about relativity that's free of those two extremes. The second section of the text is going to establish that the teachings on the aggregates are an interpretable teaching. And if you don't know what that means, that's fine. We'll go into that later. Then the third part of the text is going to talk about perceiving the faults of clinging to the aggregates. The aggregates are parts of our psychophysical being that we cling to. And then the last section, the fourth section, we'll talk about the benefits of liberation. So anytime that I go along here, if you have a question, feel free to bring it up and we can stop and slow down a little bit. Okay, so that's who wrote it. Nagarjuna is who wrote it. So what are the benefits of learning about this subject? In the Sumachaya collection, there's a sutra called The Gift Made by the Noble Youth. In that sutra, it says, if one were to practice the first 5 paramitas of generosity, morality, patience, effort, and concentration for many eons over the course of countless lifetimes, you would accrue unimaginable virtuous karma in your continuum. Compared to that, if one hears even a single verse about emptiness and entertains even a little doubt about whether or not it's true, the virtue would be infinitely greater than countless eons of practicing the first 5 paramitas. So that's one citation. In the Diamond Cutter Sutra, it gives an analogy about someone offering precious gems, filling many world systems. But it says that someone who puts any effort into studying or preserving teachings on emptiness creates even a much vaster store of virtuous karma in their mind. In the Tathagata's 7 reasoning, it says that even one who engages in the 10 negative karmas of killing, lying, stealing, sexual misconduct, divisive speech, abusive speech, gossip, covetousness, malice, and wrong views. Those are the 10 root non-virtues in Buddhism. So even somebody who's engaged in those really horrible actions, which, by the way, if you enter into them, it means that your karma is pulling you into the worst kinds of incarnations, where the suffering is really intense. If such a person even studies or teaches a little bit about emptiness, it will keep them from falling into those negative rebirths, it said. So you might be going, okay, is this true? Right? But when you start to understand emptiness correctly, you'll start to understand why it could be true. There's another sutra called Subduing Mara. Mara is a name for the Buddhist concept of evil, right? So subduing evil, if you will. There's a verse that says that any misdeed that you might do, if you gain a realization that all misdeeds lack inherent nature to them, beginninglessly, and that they're never separated from peace, which means their ultimate nature is that shunyata that we're going to describe. Then even if you've entered into what are called the 5 immediate misdeeds, which are deeds that will throw you into a hell room as soon as you die, that person will overcome the harmful effects of those misdeeds in their continuum. It is possible to purify that negative karma from the root. Usually in Buddhism, we apply what's called the four opponent powers. Many of you might have heard confession. Like if you're Catholic, you go to confession. And it's similar to that, but it's a little different in Buddhism, the four opponent powers. Confession is one part of purifying a negative deed that you've done and that's in your continuum. Although the only thing that does is it removes the misdeed of concealment, where you're kind of concealing your misdeeds from others. And so confessing kind of gets it out of your heart and into the clean air, if you will. But the other opponent powers are to regret what you've done, to recall enlightened beings and their teachings in the enlightened community and take refuge there, and to work to purify the misdeed that you've done. And they have 6 different ways you can purify those kinds of misdeeds. Of those 6 different ways to purify it, contemplating emptiness is considered the most powerful, the most expedient. And then the 4th opponent power is to refrain from doing whatever it is again. And it's said that if you do that, you can purify even the worst things that you've done. So there's a story, there's a sutra in the Buddhist canon. It's called the sutra that dispels the regret of Ajatasattu. Many of you have probably heard of this sutra. Ajatasattu was a prince, and his father was in the time, this was in the time of Buddha. His father was a king named Bimbisara. And Bimbisara followed the Buddha, and he attained arhatship, which is a state beyond suffering, the state where the mental afflictions have been eliminated from the mind. So Ajatasattu took on the advice of a bad mentor named Devadatta. And Devadatta, who was a relative of the Buddha who was jealous of the fame and the prominence that the Buddha came to when he became enlightened, Devadatta told Ajatasattu, well, you become king quicker if you kill your father. So he told him to kill his father. I mentioned the 5 misdeeds that will send you into a hell directly on your death. That's 2 of them. To kill a parent or to kill an arhat is considered so heinous that when you die, there's no gap between your death and entering into a hellish birth. So Ajatasattu did that based on Devadatta's advice, and he was horrified. Afterwards, he couldn't practice spirituality anymore because he just felt completely like he was destined to hell, which he was. And so the Buddha saw this, and he saw what had happened. And he realized that to help Ajatasattu so he could re-enter Dharma practice and purify himself and have some chance, that he had to somehow lift him out of that state that he was in, that negative state of mind. And so what he said to them, what Buddha said to him, I cannot say that someone who contemplates the emptiness of negative karma, even one who has committed any of the 5 immediate misdeeds, has a karmic obstacle. And when he said that to Ajatasattu, it lifted his spirits and gave him hope, and he re-entered the path, and eventually he was able to clean away all of his negativity and attain the state of an arhat himself. So that's all the power of this teaching. Those are all aspects of the power of the teaching. Um, in Arya David's verses, um, he said that even a person who's weak in merit, who lacks any insight to fathom the profound teachings on emptiness, who generates a doubt, thinking maybe emptiness is true. Since ignorance is the root of that cycle of suffering that I mentioned, that person has shredded the root of cyclic existence, just entertaining that doubt. So it goes on and on. The benefits are limitless. I thought I'd read you just a little bit from The Perfection of Wisdom in 8,000 Lines, where Buddha's teaching this subject of emptiness. And there's a god there in the assembly of his disciples named Sakra, and he's listening to the teachings. And so Sakra says, how will people understand how important this teaching is that you're giving, Buddha? And Buddha said, so it is, Sakra. A few men of this world are endowed with perfect faith in the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha. Fewer than those are those who attain the fruits of a stream winner. A stream winner is somebody who's they've reached a spiritual stage where they're in a stream to become free of suffering if they continue their path. And after that, fewer still are a once returner. A once returner is somebody who's purified themselves that they're only going to be reborn in this world system of desire one more time before they enter into more celestial rebirths. Or even rarer is a never returner, somebody who's extinguished the cause of being born in this kind of world system that we're in. And even fewer still are those who reach the state of an arhat. An arhat literally means a foe destroyer, somebody who's eliminated their afflictions from their root and is free of cyclic suffering forever. So it gets rarer and rarer. Fewer still realized the solitary realizer's enlightenment. That's somebody who, even without teachings in this life, through their own reasoning, reaches these realizations and becomes free of mental afflictions and the suffering they cause. Still are those who, having raised their thoughts to full enlightenment, that means they've generated that bodhisattva mind of wanting to become enlightened to help all beings, and strengthen that thought. In addition, who dwell in vigor. Fewer still are those who pursue meditation on the perfection of wisdom. Fewer still those who course in the perfection of wisdom. And fewer still are those who, coursing, striving in the perfection of wisdom, abide in an irreversible bodhisattva stage. That's where, on the path of enlightenment, you reach a stage where nothing will pull you back into a lower earth or a lower level of spiritual attainment. Fewer still are those who, coursing and striving in perfection of wisdom, will know full Buddhahood and enlightenment. So it's very rare what this is leading to. It's very rare to hear these teachings. It's very rare to get to contemplate them. We're very fortunate in that we have valid commentaries from Nagarjuna, Chandrakirti, Tsongkhapa, and others, and that we've heard those valid commentaries through great teachers like Yume Khyentse Rinpoche, Serme Khyentse Rinpoche, His Holiness the Dalai Lama, and others. So even though I spent a lot of time on this, I hope you'll rejoice. While the Buddha was teaching the text I was just mentioning, the 8,000 verses of the perfection of wisdom, there was this kind of band of thugs that were walking by in the vicinity of where he was teaching, and they didn't like his teachings. They kind of had wrong views, and they were thinking of walking over to his group and disrupting it. And it said that through the power of wisdom, it changed their minds, that they suddenly just decided not to go do it, and they prostrated and went their way. And that's one of the powers of wisdom. It turns back obstacles. The Buddha in this same sutra said that if you filled countless world systems with reliquaries praising the Buddha, hearing one verse of the perfection of wisdom would be much vaster, virtuous spiritual power in your mind. So let's get into it. It starts out with this line. I'll switch over to the Tibetan so you can see it there. Jampil Shunur Yurpa La Cha Selo. And the meaning of that in English is reverence to the insight hero Manjushri. That's how he translated it. The ever youthful Manjushri. Manjushri, you've probably seen images of Manjushri. It said that the figure behind me, Tsongkhapa, was an emanation of Manjushri, that he was of the same continuum as Manjushri. Manjushri's thought of as the Bodhisattva of wisdom, an incredibly penetrating insight. The ever youthful Manjushri means that in any moment of time, the omniscient mind of the Bodhisattva Manjushri can see all things in their emptiness simultaneously. Therefore, it's ever youthful because things are always in flux, right? So the Manjushri is constantly seeing reality as it is. And I said this style of teaching came from the Buddha through Manjushri, and then through Manjushri to Nagarjuna. And Nagarjuna brought it to us in these verses. Okay, so it's an homage that was put in by the translators. And it's typical of somebody when they're writing a text like this to start out with some kind of homage to an enlightened being. And so that's what that is. Which brings us to the first verse. You'll notice that this is numbered 0. It's not counted as one of the 60 verses. But it's customary when one of the ancient sages would write a text to start out with homage to the source. And here Manjushri, in his opening verse, is paying homage to the Buddha. It's an homage to the Buddha. I bow to the Lord of sages who proclaim relativity. Joseph Loizo, throughout the text, has translated Tenching Jua is the Tibetan. He's translated it as relativity. Yeah, as translation goes, kinda, right? But I'll get into the word by word so that you know what this means, right? But for now, we'll call it relativity. The way by which he abandoned real creation and destruction. All right, so this is getting into the meat of it right away. Let's go to the Tibetan because I don't want you to get stuck on the word relativity. I want you to understand more about what's being translated here. So Kangi, this is the first word. That means by whom, the person by whom. And he's talking about the Buddha here. By whom, Ke means birth. Ang means and, Jikpa means destruction. So all of us here, I usually joke that the Surgeon General should put on our birth certificate a warning that birth may result in death. Because as soon as you're born, you're going to die. There's no way out. There's no other way out, right? Um, so he's talking about the birth and death of us as beings, but he's also talking about the birth and death of any phenomena. So Dak means those, birth and death and destruction. Sul di, this method, yi, by it, ni, Pongyurba means abandoned, birth and death. The one who was able to abandon, eliminate birth and death. And so this gets to the word that Joseph Luiso translated as relativity. Then, I'm trying to get to the Sanskrit term. Den in Sanskrit is pratitya. And that means simply to depend. But pratitya, to depend on something. Ching means and. Junwa means to arise. The Sanskrit term is samubada. Junwa. It arises, it shows existence. Then means that all phenomena are completely dependent on other things. What happens to our bodies if we don't drink enough fluid or if we don't eat enough food? They won't survive, right? They totally depend on enough rest, food, shelter, water, things like that. We depend on a lot of things, each of us. If you think back to when we were born, what were we before we were conceived, right? Which gets into a bigger question. Let's just take the part of us that is our body, because we have lots of parts to us. But let's just take our body. Whence did it come? We know that a special substance from our father had to join a special substance from our mother. Otherwise, we wouldn't have been born, right? So what we call my body, actually we borrowed from our parents, right? And so our body is one of those 5 aggregates I mentioned earlier, the form aggregate. These 5 aggregates that comprise our being are all borrowed. And so they're called acquired. We've acquired these things. It's like if you have a house with a lot of junk in it, it didn't all appear at once. It's years of kind of hoarding and picking things up along the way. So similarly, that's the Buddhist view about our 5 heaps. When we were born, when we were conceived, what we call my body was actually borrowed from our parents. And then that forming fetus was nurtured from nutrients that we got from our moms, who got it from eating, right? And then when we took birth from her and she nurtured us, or whoever nurtured us, fed us with milk and other things until that body we borrowed got bigger and bigger. And then it finally grew fully. And if you live to my age, then it starts falling apart. Hair comes out, it goes gray, right? It's all borrowed, isn't it? Really. And that's the meaning of 10. Just that one aspect of us is completely dependent on other things. It didn't suddenly arise spontaneously. Junwa, arise. By the way, that 10 part, I mentioned two extremes, nihilism and eternalism. That 10 part gets rid of the eternalistic thought that, oh, this is my body, it's always been my body and always will be my body. If you look at Western movies about the afterlife, when they show the protagonists in the afterlife, it's always in the same body they had while they were alive. Well, in a Buddhist point of view, that's absurd. The body that we've acquired now, based on our parents' genetics, that are now our genetics, and then the food we've eaten and everything else, that's going to disappear when we die. It's gone. The mental continuum from the Buddhist point of view will go on. And what shapes it depends on what we do now, what we say, what we think, what we do with our bodies. That's all shaping what we're becoming. My teacher, Serme Kinnerpache, used to say, if you want to see what you did in the past, take a look in the mirror. Because what we are now is an arisal of karma and causation and conditions from past actions. Then my teacher said, if you want to see what you're going to be in the future, take a look at your mind. Because our minds are constantly shaping what we say, what we do, what we think, what we enter into. And that's creating karma. So I mentioned there are 5 aggregates. One aggregate is our form that I just went into. That's the most obvious of the 5 aggregates. And those of you who study with Art Engel, you went through an analogy of cooking food. And from preparation of food, that form aspect of our being, he compared to a vessel that you're going to cook your meal in. A little less obvious in our form is our feelings of pleasure, pain, and indifference. They're related to our form. Like our nerves pick up sensations that send us signals like, this feels good, or this is horrible, this is painful, right? Or, I don't really care. That doesn't affect me, right? And so the feelings is a little less coarse than our form aggregate, but that, in the analogy of cooking, it's compared to our meal. That's our meal that we're preparing in that vessel of our body, our feelings. So a little less coarse than that is the part of our mind that discriminates between things and discerns the difference between things and categorizes things and labels them and conceptualizes about them. That's called our Dujeki Pumbo, our discrimination heap or discernment heap. And that's compared in the analogy of cooking a meal to condiments, like spicing up the food that we're going to partake of. So then the fourth, these past 2 are mental aggregates, and the first is physical aggregate, right? The next 2 are also mental, and they're a little more subtle than discrimination aggregate is our volitional or our formational aggregate. In the West, we call these emotions. We also call them feelings. Those 2 words are kind of used interchangeably very often. But these are the different mental impulses that some of them are good, some are bad, some are neutral. But in Buddhist psychology, they categorize like many, many different categories of negative and positive states of mind and emotions. And in the analogy of cooking, this is compared to the cook. Why? because of all those different impulses, those are what motivate us to do things, to think things, to say things, to physically enter into action. And that's what creates karma. The karmic seeds that we carry in our mental continuum are created by volition, and that's compared to the cook cooking the meal that eventually we're going to have to eat. Right? And so then what's the fifth aggregate? Well, that's awareness. That's our consciousness. We have sensory consciousness, sight, smell, taste, hearing, touch. We have mental consciousness. And that's what experiences what we go through. And so it's considered, in the analogy of cooking, it's compared to the person who eats the food, right? The food, the cook, the volitions prepare the karma that ripen as our feelings of pleasure and pain. That's the food. And then the consciousness is what experiences it. So all of these things we arrive on dependently. So the 10 shows that they don't exist on their own. They're empty of anything that exists from its own side independently, inherently. That's the 10. Jung, the problem with just staying there, if we just start with everything's dependent, so it doesn't have any self nature to it, it's empty of self nature. The problem, if we just stay there, then you can fall into nihilism and start to think, well, then nothing has any purpose and nothing really exists, that kind of thinking. To balance that, 10, dependent, Qing, and Zhonghua, arising based on dependence. Things arise, and that gets rid of the nihilism. The 10 gets rid of the eternalism. The Zhonghua, the arising, gets rid of the nihilism. So things appear. They may be empty of self nature, but they still function. They still appear. So I had a friend once say to me, when he was studying this kind of stuff, he got into a little bit of nihilism, and he had the thought, well, I could walk in front of a car, and if I don't believe it's real, I'll be okay. And I thought, don't try it. That's a big mistaken notion. you know just because things don't have self nature doesn't mean they don't exist. They have a relative way of existing, and they impact. That's how they impact. If they had self nature, they couldn't have effects. So don't walk into traffic. Be careful. But anyway, that's the basic concept. Tendan Junwa, dependently arisen, dependent origination. I don't know why Joseph translated that as relatively. I can kind of see it. But I think the real words are a little bit more guttural, a little more solid. Dependent origination is what we're talking about. Sungba. Yeah, Chief, go ahead.
Yeah, so I just had a quick question on the nomenclature here, Mr. Wilson. So, well, first thing first, something is coming to my mind saying, so Nagarjuna, when he wrote the Madhya Katira, the starting stanza, I would say, the four extremes, arising and destruction and annihilation and permanence. It will talk about coming and going. Compared to that, when he starts this out, he says just the dependent origination. He doesn't dwell more into that. Was this written before or after the other one?
I think this came later. However, it doesn't contradict it. Tendang Junwa encompasses all of that. In the Mula Madhyamaka, the text you're reciting or that you're referring to, he starts out no coming, no going, no arising, no destruction, no many, no singular. He
Right.
goes through several dichotomy things and he negates each one. And so to understand that, you have to know what it is he's saying isn't true.
Hello.
Um, this is the key. This is really the key. It's called the object of negation, gotcha in Tibetan. The object of negation. What is it that Nagarjuna is saying is empty, is denying? If you don't understand that, you'll get confused. But if you understand it, it'll be very coherent and it will wake you up. You'll become enlightened if you really have the correct view of what he's talking about here. So what he's refuting is anything that has a nature that exists from its own side independently, a unity without any dependence on anything else. And he's saying there's really no such thing. And that way you could say relativity. That's kind of Einstein's word for, everything's relative. And Buddha wouldn't disagree. The word for relative reality is kunzo, deceptive reality or concealed reality. And so when we walk around in the world and we see people, we think, oh, there's a person, I'm a person, there's a car, there's a tree. And before we think too much about it, a part of our mind just imputes that there's this thing there, existing from its own side. When we slow it down and go into detail, somebody's mic is just be careful. Let's see. I can check on that. It'll just take me a second. Feel free if you're going to say something, go ahead and unmute yourself, but I'm just going to go ahead and mute folks for the time being so that the background noise isn't there. All right, so the crucial thing is to understand what it is he's saying is empty, because otherwise you'll fall into nihilism. But if you understand that object of negation properly, you'll start to see the parts of your mind that are confused, that naturally we kind of, without thinking about it, we think, I'm me, right? I'm just this me. We have a sense, oh, I'm genuine, we have a sense of who we are. And unexamined, we just take it as existing independently. But when you start looking into it, you can see, no, it's really dependent origination. It has no self nature to it. In its core, it's empty of self nature. And when you realize that, then you can understand how karma works and you can understand how the path works to enlightenment. So, so I would say, Jeev, that it includes all of the stuff he wrote in the Mula Madhyamaka. It doesn't contradict it at all. It just can be summarized in that one expression, tendang jua. Depending on this arises, right? All right, so Sumba means the one who taught that. Tu Buang, Tu Buang. Tu means Muni. Muni implies control or dominion over something. Anybody who's reached the seventh bhumi of the Bodhisattva path and beyond has, or who's eliminated their afflictions, is considered a true Sangha jewel. They're a foe destroyer. They destroyed their own afflictions. The Buddha is considered beyond that, in that he also eliminated obstacles to complete knowledge, omniscient knowledge. Wong means like a lord of the capable. Muni could be, Tub could be called capable. And Wong means a lord of all the capable ones, of all the arhats and bodhisattva aryas and so forth. So all Buddhist traditions have their own interpretations of, well, first, let me just finish the homage. He's saying, Dela, to that one, Jaksalo, I pay homage to you, I prostrate to you. And I'll go back to the English so you can read it in English. I bow to the Lord of sages who proclaimed relativity, the way by which he abandoned real creation and destruction. So you notice that Joseph Luizo, the translator, put in brackets real, and that's pointing at the object of negation here. So when it in the text, it doesn't say that. It just says kedang jikpa, birth and destruction. And so if you read it and you don't know the commentary and you don't know these fine points, you might fall into nihilism. Oh, so Nagarjuna is saying there's no birth and there's no death. And that's a misunderstanding. He's saying there's no self-existent birth, self-existent death. All right. Any questions? Should I push on? All right. I was mentioning there were lots of different school systems in Buddhism, and they all feel towards the Buddha the same way that Nagarjuna did here, that he was the one who taught dependent origination. In fact, there's a story of Tsongkhapa, the great sage of the 14th century, where he had studied everything, all the different scriptures in Tibet. He had mastered them. He could memorize volumes of scripture. Nobody could defeat him in debate. And he, you've heard me say this story before, so I'll just shorten it, but I want to say it for the newcomers. He met a lama who was clairvoyant named Lama Umapa. And Lama Umapa was having visions of Tsongkhapa that led him to seek him out. At the same time, Tsongkhapa was having visions of Lama Umapa that led him to seek him out. And they met, and they had this conversation. And Lama Umapa told Tsongkhapa that ever since he was a young boy, he would hear the mantra of Manjushri, the Bodhisattva wisdom, and would have these visions of him. And every morning, Manjushri would appear and teach him a verse of scripture, and sometimes predict what was going to happen to him that day and guide him. And so Umapa asked Tsongkhapa, are my visions real or am I crazy? What's going on here? And so Tsongkhapa talked to him a long time, and he realized, he said, you're not crazy. After he examined all the different visions he had, he said, you're not crazy. He's really appearing to you, but he's appearing to your mind sense, not to your sensory faculties. He's appearing directly to your mind, which is why you're getting a little confused. And then Tsongkhapa said, by the way, would you be able to ask him something for me? Because Tsongkhapa, even though he was the greatest scholar alive, still was confused. And so Umapa obliged, and then Tsongkhapa had this conversation with this Manjushri that was appearing to his mind consciousness and translated for Tsongkhapa. And Tsongkhapa told him his view about dependent arising and emptiness. And after he told Manjushri through Umapa what his view was, he said, so is my view like the highest view of Prasanjika Madhyamaka, or more like the lower view of Madhyamaka, the Svatantric view? And Manjushri replied, neither. And Tsongkhapa was crestfallen. And he said, well, how do I get to the correct view? And Manjushri, through Amapa, said, constantly supplicate your teachers, constantly purify your negative karma, and constantly accumulate virtuous states of mind and virtues in your mind, and go into retreat. And he told him to do this extensive retreat in southern Tibet. And so Tsongkhapa did so. And after arduous practice over years, one morning he had a dream of all the sages of this lineage, Nagarjuna, Chandakirti, all these great sages sitting around a campfire. And one of them got up, I think it was Buddha Palita, who was one of the lineage masters. He got up with a text in the dream and he handed it to Tsongkhapa, and he turned it to a specific page in a specific verse. And so that morning when Tsongkhapa woke up, he got out that text and he turned it to that page and he read the verse, and right then he got correct view. It finally hit him. and he wasn't completely enlightened, but he really at that point understood what's in these verses, and got direct experience of it. And so he wrote this famous poem called The Praise of the Buddha for his teachings on dependent origination. And in it, he talks about how the word teacher, Champa in Tibetan, teacher, is wasted on anybody who doesn't understand dependent origination correctly. That only the most capable, only the most profound of sages can deserve that title of Champa, of teacher. And the reason they deserve it is because they teach dependent origination. And so when I heard this, I thought about it, because I was raised Christian and I've studied other religions, and I realized it's true that, while other religions do touch on it, like for instance in Christianity, you'll see as ye sow, so shall ye reap. Well, that's dependent origination that Jesus taught right from his mouth in the New Testament, right? But he left it there, right? And then he went more into faith and other things and morality. It's all good. But it was really the Buddha who went into detail about dependent origination. That was unique. And so that's what Nagarjuna is referring to here. The one, the capable one, the teacher of the sages, the capable one, I'm prostrating to you because you're the one who taught dependent origination. And so Tsongkhapa and other sages, and I'm not dissing any other religion because I think they all contain this in them if you look for it, but I'm just saying that it's more explicitly laid out here. And so that's what we're going to be going into in more detail. So let me just talk for a moment about some of those other school systems, and feel free to jump in if you get confused because it is a big topic. So this text, when Nagarjuna composed it, I mentioned he wasn't really aiming it towards nihilism. In fact, in one of his verses, verse 2, you who have eliminated nihilism, the source of all ills, should attend to the reasons why absolutism must be rejected as well. And so pretty much he's saying, yeah, nihilism is not where it's at. That's a mistaken view, and it will just destroy you and everybody around you. And that's already been covered. But you people who believe that there's a real nature to things also have an obstacle in your way. It's generally considered that if you have a choice between being a nihilist and an eternalist, it's better to be an eternalist because even as I say, most religions, if they're practiced properly, can be good for you. You know, do virtue, don't do bad things, help people. And even though you're seeing those people and those deeds as real and existing in from their own side, it still creates causes in your mind for better rebirth and better future and better current events for you, your family, people around you. And so in that way, it's okay. But if you want to be free of suffering altogether and get out of the cycle of existence and become fully enlightened to help all other beings, you've also got to get rid of that eternalistic view. And so when Nagarjuna wrote this text, he was aiming at two lower schools of Buddhist tenets that were existent in his time. At his time, those of you who know Buddhist philosophy know that they're the Yogacaran school. That came much later. And there were other great teachers who refuted that. And then the Svatantric Madhyamaka school didn't come till after Nagarjuna. And so there were other great sages who refuted that, like Tsongkhapa and others. So where Nagarjuna was aiming this text was to the Vaibhashika school and the Sautrantic school of Buddhism. They can be called the analysts and the traditionalists that were abundant in his time in Buddhism. So that's where the target was in his discourse at this point. And we'll get into all of those different schools and what they mean and what the slight differences are between them. So I mentioned Dendang Junwa, Pratitya. Pratitya actually is a Sanskrit word for Tenjing Jua, the whole dependent origination. Samupadya, origination, appearance. And then Upadaya means dependently in Tibetan. That's dene. Depending on this comes. There's another word, and this is from a higher school of Buddhism that you should understand as we go into this text. The word is dak, which means ascribed. So that word ascribed is used by people in the highest school of wisdom in Buddhism, the Prasajika Madhyamaka. And so I'll just explain it before we dive into other verses. I mentioned the 5 heaps that constitute our being: our form heap, our feeling heap, our discernment heap, our compositional factors and volition, and our awareness, including sensory awareness. So based on those 5 psychophysical aggregations that are constantly changing within us, we ascribe a person. Oh, there's Wilson, or there's Jeeves, or there's, right? And so that's called imputation. So in the highest school of Buddhism, that exists. We exist based on a mere mental ascription on a valid basis for designation. That is real. So the highest school of Buddhism doesn't have any problem with the ordinary parlance of the world. So if you go out and somebody says, oh, there's a blue car, Prasajika Madhyamaka person will say, yeah. The difference between the ordinary, oh, there's a blue car, And the Prasangika Madhyamaka view is the person, an ordinary person, saying there's a blue car, would be, in addition to ascribing blue, the color blue, and the word car to the vehicle, there would be an underlying misassumption that the car existed from its own side. Whereas somebody who is steeped in Prasangika and Madhyamaka would not have that second part of it. They would see it as a dependently arisen vehicle coming from many causes and conditions with the temporal description blue car. And why is this so important? When we die, if we have built up a lifetime of clinging to me and mine and all the different actions that we've done to preserve me and mine, then we've built up a truckload of negative karma in our mind that is going to define what we become. In contrast, if we develop our wisdom and the perfections and other positive spiritual qualities in our mind, we will travel light into our future lives. We don't have all that baggage that's going to pull us down. So this is actually absolutely crucial to understand and to understand correctly. The more you understand this correctly, the more you'll understand that karma is real, right? Not self-existent, but it really happens, and it is shaping us now, and it will shape what we become. And therefore, we have to be mindful of what we say, what we do, what we think through our day-to-day life. So I know we didn't get far, but I wanted to introduce it appropriately. Thanks, Chief. All right, well, I'm going to stop here. I'm going to say the dedication prayer, and if there are any questions, feel free to stick with us for a little bit, and then we'll continue this this in more depth as we go forward. Gani rawe goe jingande bendande wa malu juwene kenrezi wan tenzin gazo ye shebe sibe padu tengyurchi. Okay. Any questions for me? Did I thoroughly bore you or confuse you?
Actually, I do have one question. It's not a big deal, but the translation that I printed out, it's not matching what you're putting on the screen.
Yeah, sorry
I
about
mean, it's
that.
okay. I kind of got that relativity when you were going, was original, dependent origination. I figured that much out. So it's okay that it's different. It's probably closer to what it really means.
Yeah, I actually, of the two translations, I trust more the one I sent you, the
Okay.
one by Tupten Jimpa, because Tupten Jimpa is just meticulous about how he translates. And he had an Oxford University Western education as well as a thorough education in Tibetan Buddhism. And so his translation is optimal, but I found that Joseph, his translation was a little more readable, and the other one was kind of small print, and his was a little more verse by verse. So
Right. Okay. That I was just curious about the difference, but okay. Thanks.
any other questions before we jump?
Thank you, Wilson.
Thank you all for being here, and I'll look forward to next time. Sharon's gonna help us get this recording into a link. And so I'll send it out to all of you along with the next date. And want to see it again. All right. All right.
Thank
Take
you, Wilson. Long
Thank
life,
you,
keep
Wilson.
teaching.
Long life to you guys too.